If you agree that respect should never depend on appearances, make sure to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Because what happened in that cafeteria proves that quiet strength will always outrank arrogance. They called her just another face. No insignia, no authority. Just a young woman sitting alone at the far corner table. Her plain olive jacket dusted with road grit and her hands wrapped around a bowl of soup gone cold. The recruits didn't know her name, didn't care to. They only saw what they wanted to see. A civilian, maybe a low-level clerk sneaking into the base diner during lunch hour. Head bent, tired, forgettable. The kind of person you mock because you assume she'll never talk back. And that's exactly what made their laughter so loud. But before we go any further, here's what no one in that room knew. Captain Elise Monroe, age 28, had commanded over 300 soldiers across 2 continents. She'd spent 5 years leading tactical operations so precise that even the generals deferred to her judgment. She had a degree in combat logistics, 3 commendations for leadership under fire, and a silence sharper than any blade. And yet, in this small base diner on the edge of Fort Haven, surrounded by recruits half her rank, she looked like nothing more than a stranger trying to finish a meal. It started like any other afternoon. The fluorescent lights hummed. Metal trays clattered. The smell of reheated stew mixed with burnt coffee. Elise had come for a few quiet minutes to review the new assignment schedule. A stack of forms folded neatly beside her. No uniform, no fanfare, just rest between storms. She was off duty, technically, but discipline doesn't turn off. Even out of uniform, her posture gave her away, straight-backed, calm, observant. And that's what drew attention she hadn't asked for. At the next table sat Private Jax Taylor, barely 20, his boots still too clean to tell stories. He was the loud one, the kind of recruit who thought volume equaled confidence. 2 of his buddies flanked him, nodding and laughing in rhythm as he spoke. They were fresh from training, still high on adrenaline, and far too new to understand that arrogance and ignorance often were the same face. "Hey, clerk," Jax called across the table, his grin sharp and cruel. "You lost?" "Civilian food court's that way." His friend snickered. Elise didn't respond. She just lifted her spoon, took a slow sip, and went back to her paperwork. That silence, her refusal to play their game, made them bolder. "Bet she's one of those base assistants," the second recruit muttered. "You know, the ones who file paperwork for real soldiers." More laughter. "Probably writes memos about dress code violations." Still, Elise said nothing. She didn't even glance up. Her focus remained on her papers, her calm so deliberate it almost felt like defiance. The cook behind the counter, an older vet with a limp and a permanent scowl, looked up from his ladle. He knew that face. He'd seen her before in the officer's wing. His eyes narrowed, but he didn't say a word. Sometimes truth needs no defense. It just waits. But the boys weren't done. Jack stood, tray in hand, swaggering like he owned the place. "What's the matter?" he said, voice dripping with mockery. "Too proud to talk to the people who actually serve?" He leaned over her table, blocking her light. Elise finally looked up. Her gaze met his for the briefest moment. Not cold, not angry, just steady. It was the kind of look that could quiet a battlefield. But Jax was too young to understand what he'd just stepped into. He smirked. "Guess not," he muttered, and with a flick of his wrist, his tray tilted. The soup spilled. A slow, deliberate splash. Scalding broth and vegetables cascading down the front of her jacket, dripping onto her papers, staining the table. The room went dead silent. The laughter that had been building vanished like a snuffed flame. Someone dropped a fork. Even the humming lights seemed to dim for a second. Elise didn't move. Not at first. Steam curled from the soaked fabric of her sleeve. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then, with the precision of someone who'd faced far worse than soup and insults, she reached for a napkin. One wipe across her sleeve, another across her cheek. She folded the ruined papers neatly, tucked them under her arm, and stood. The recruits froze. Jax half laughed, trying to pretend it was all a joke. "Hey, I didn't mean." She cut him off with a glance. A single, calm, quiet look. The kind that doesn't need words to say, "You've already said enough." Then she turned toward the cook. "Sorry for the mess," she said softly. Her voice was low but clear, the kind of voice that expects to be obeyed even when it doesn't demand it. The cook opened his mouth to speak, but she was already walking toward the door. Not rushing, not retreating, just walking, every step measured. The door closed behind her, and for a long moment, no one moved. The silence felt heavier than the laughter had ever been. Jax exhaled, nervous, forcing a grin. What? It's just soup. The cook slammed his ladle into the counter, so hard it echoed through the room. Boy, he said, his voice rough with years of command. You better pray you never see her again. Why? Who even is she? The cook leaned forward, eyes narrowing like steel. That woman, he said slowly, has more soldiers under her than you have days of service. The recruits laughed it off at first, uneasy, uncertain. But in the pit of Jax's stomach, something cold began to form. Because the way the cook had said it didn't sound like rumor. It sounded like truth. Outside, the afternoon sun burned low over Fort Haven. Elise walked across the tarmac, her soaked jacket sticking to her skin. She didn't wipe it again. She didn't need to. The humiliation didn't touch her where it mattered. She'd seen arrogance before, on battlefields, in briefing rooms, in men who thought power came from shouting. She knew better. Power, real power, comes from restraint. By the time she reached the main command building, her uniform was back on. Her nameplate gleamed. Her rank, Captain Monroe, Battalion Commander, caught the light just as she stepped inside. A junior officer at the door saluted sharply. Ma'am, he said. She returned it with quiet precision. Back at the cafeteria, Private Jax Taylor still tried to laugh off the warning. He's bluffing, he told his friends. No way that lady's in command. But his voice wavered. Because somewhere deep down, he knew, respect ignored always comes back louder. And by morning, he'd find out exactly how loud it could be. The next morning, Fort Haven was quiet in that eerie way only bases could be, when the wind carried discipline instead of noise. Recruits lined up in the parade yard, boots polished, faces still half asleep, wondering why the entire 3rd Company had been summoned on a day with no scheduled drills. The sun was still low, streaking the yard in pale gold. Sergeant Reeves barked orders, his voice echoing through the courtyard, his expression unreadable. He didn't tell them why they were there, only that command wanted eyes forward and mouth shut. Private Jax Taylor stood among the rows, jaw tight, trying to mask the nervous energy that gnawed at him. The laughter from the day before still echoed faintly in his memory, but it no longer felt sharp, it felt stupid. The cook's words wouldn't leave him alone. That woman has more soldiers under her than you have days of service. He'd barely slept, brushing off his guilt by telling himself it was a misunderstanding. But as the minutes dragged, and the sergeant's tension grew heavier, denial began to fade. At precisely 0700, the sound of approaching boots silenced everything. Not the uneven shuffle of recruits. No, this was synchronized. Purposeful. Command presence. The side doors opened, and 4 senior officers walked into formation, led by Colonel Patrick Greer, Fort Haven's commanding officer. His face was carved from stone, and behind him trailed someone smaller, younger, her step quiet but steady. She wore her uniform crisp and perfect, her posture straight as a rifle barrel. It was her, Captain Elise Monroe. Jax's stomach dropped. Every rumor, every whisper from the cafeteria now screamed as truth. The woman he'd mocked, the one whose soup he'd spilled, now stood at the front of the formation, her presence so sharp that even the air seemed to stand still. Colonel Greer faced the rows of recruits, his tone clipped and unforgiving. Yesterday, he began, a member of this base staff was subjected to behavior that violated not only military decorum, but human decency. 3 recruits thought disrespect would earn them laughter. He turned slightly toward Elise, stepping aside. Captain Monroe has requested to handle this personally. The silence that followed was thick. Every recruit shifted slightly, standing straighter, as Elise stepped forward. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her calm was command enough. When I was your age, she began, her tone even, deliberate. I thought rank meant power, that the louder voice would win the room. It took years to learn that silence holds more weight than shouting ever will. Her gaze swept the formation, steady and cutting. Yesterday, 3 of you decided I was beneath you, that I wasn't worth respect. No one breathed. Elise paused. The wind tugged lightly at the hem of her jacket. You didn't know who I was. But that's not the point. Respect isn't supposed to depend on who's watching or what title someone carries. It's supposed to be constant, unshaken. Her eyes locked on the row where Jax stood. Private Taylor, she said simply. The line shifted as soldiers glanced at him. His face went pale, his throat dry. "Ma'am," he stammered. "Step forward." He obeyed, boots heavy on the asphalt. The moment he stopped before her, he realized how tall she actually stood, not in height, but in presence. Up close, there was no doubt. This was command. "Private," Elise said softly. "Yesterday, you looked me in the eye and poured soup on my uniform. Do you remember why?" He swallowed. "Ma'am, I thought." "Finish it." "I thought you were a civilian man." Her expression didn't shift. "And that made disrespect acceptable?" "No, ma'am." "Then what made it funny?" Jax opened his mouth, but no words came. Elise studied him for a long moment. Not with anger, but with the kind of measured silence that made guilt louder than shouting ever could. Finally, she stepped back. "Private Taylor, Private Reed, Private Olson, all three of you will report to base operations for immediate reassignment to disciplinary support duty. Effective today, you'll serve in the cafeteria you disrespected, under the supervision of the same staff you mocked. You'll learn that humility is the first mark of service." A murmur rippled through the ranks. None dared to react loudly. Elise's tone softened just slightly as she continued, "Not just for them, but for everyone listening. You will not salute me out of fear. You will not obey because you're afraid of punishment. You will respect this uniform because it represents something bigger than any one of us. It represents everyone who earned their place through discipline and sacrifice." Colonel Greer watched from the side, his arms folded, a faint nod of approval ghosting across his features. Elise turned her gaze back to the formation. "Some of you will rise fast," she said. "Others will struggle. But all of you will be remembered by how you treat those who can't defend themselves. That's leadership." The words landed heavy, echoing in the morning stillness. The recruits stood taller now, their shame settling into quiet understanding. Jax swallowed hard, eyes fixed on the ground. "Ma'am," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Permission to speak?" Elise nodded once. "I was wrong," he said, his throat tightening. "I disrespected you in this uniform. I'll own it." Her expression remained composed, but there was the faintest glint of approval in her eyes. "Then you've already started learning," she said quietly. "Dismissed." Jax saluted, sharp, precise, and stepped back into formation. The line felt different now, heavier, older somehow. The careless arrogance that had filled the cafeteria was gone, replaced by a respect too fragile to break again. When the formation ended, the recruits dispersed quietly, no jokes, no chatter. Jax lingered behind, watching Elise speak briefly with Colonel Greer. She didn't seem angry. She just seemed steady, like a storm that had passed but left the air cleaner. As she walked away, her voice carried faintly on the wind, not directed at anyone in particular. "Rank doesn't make you better. It makes you responsible." Those words would follow Jax for a long time, longer than any punishment could. By noon, the cafeteria smelled of bleach and humility. Jax stood behind the counter, hair tucked under a net, serving soup into trays without a word. The cook glanced at him, but said nothing. Outside the window, Elise passed by on her way to headquarters, her stride confident, unhurried. Jax froze mid-scoop, his chest tightening with something unfamiliar. It wasn't fear. It was respect, raw and real. He didn't need her forgiveness. She'd already given him something better, a lesson, and from that day forward, no one at Fort Haven laughed when a quiet soldier walked into the room. The cafeteria at Fort Haven looked different a week later. Not in furniture or lighting, but in air, in tone. The chatter was quieter, the laughter softer, and when someone in uniform walked in, every head turned with a little more awareness. Respect had returned, not because it was ordered, but because it had been earned. Captain Elise Monroe sat again at her usual corner table. Same plain jacket, same bowl of soup. Only this time, the room didn't treat her as invisible. Conversations dimmed slightly as she entered, not out of fear, but acknowledgement. The cook placed the bowl before her himself, steaming hot, fresh, and free of charge. He didn't say anything, and she didn't need him to. Gratitude can live quietly between veterans without a single word. Across the room, Private Jax Taylor wiped down tables with a rag that smelled of bleach and humility. He hadn't looked up when she first walked in. Too focused, too intent on finishing his new assignment right. But when he finally turned, their eyes met. Elise didn't scowl. She didn't smirk. She simply nodded once. A small gesture, permission to rise again. The cook noticed. You got off light, he muttered to Jax as he passed, though not unkindly. Some officers would have buried you in reports. Jax nodded, his voice low. She doesn't need to bury anyone, he said. She already taught me. By the time the lunch rush ended, the cafeteria was calm. Elise closed her folder, pushed the empty bowl aside, and stood. The floor creaked faintly under her boots, the kind of sound that drew subtle attention. She glanced toward the recruits, still cleaning tables. You all learned something this week, she asked, not as command, but as teacher. Yes, ma'am, came the unison reply, quiet but sincere. She studied them for a moment, then said, Good. Then the rank did its job. The words lingered as she turned toward the door. The cook called after her softly, Captain Monroe? She stopped, half smiling. We put your photo up on the back wall, next to the others. Thought you earned it. Elise chuckled faintly. Take it down, she said. I'm not done earning anything yet. Outside, the wind had picked up. The flags lining the courtyard snapped against the pools, sunlight catching each one. Elise paused for a moment beneath them, watching new recruits crossing the yard, shoulders squared, eyes forward, laughing in that awkward, innocent way that only youth in uniform can. She smiled, because she knew one lesson had already begun to ripple through them. At that same hour, Jack stepped out into the sunlight, his sleeves rolled up, the day's work finished. He spotted her ahead, walking toward the command building. He hesitated, then jogged forward. Ma'am, he called. She stopped, turning slightly. I just wanted to say thank you, he said, breath catching. Not for the punishment, for not giving up on us. Elise looked at him for a long moment, then answered simply, You'll do the same for someone else someday. That's how it works. Then she nodded once, turned, and walked away. By evening, the story had already spread across the base. How a captain humiliated in silence turned an entire battalion back toward respect. But Elise never confirmed or denied it. When reporters from the internal communications team asked for a quote, she declined. Her only statement was the same one she lived by. Command isn't about being feared. It's about being followed willingly. Months later, when new cadets arrived, they were told the story not from her lips, but from those she'd led. They learned about the day a young officer in a plain jacket taught a base full of soldiers that leadership doesn't come from shouting. It comes from showing up, standing still, and never letting pride make you small. Private Jax Taylor finished his punishment, then re-enlisted 6 months later. He trained under a new platoon commander who, without realizing it, repeated Elise's same words during orientation. Respect isn't given to rank. It's given to character. And sometimes on quiet days, when Elise Monroe walked through the cafeteria, Jax would see her and instinctively straighten his posture, not out of fear, but gratitude. He once asked the cook, Why does she always come back here? With all the offices and officers' lounges she's got, why this place? The old veteran smiled. Because this is where she won her real command. In the corner, Elise sat by the window, a notebook open beside her soup, the steam curling like memory. Outside, the wind rippled across the flagpole, carrying with it the echoes of a single lesson that had changed everything. True leadership doesn't need recognition. It earns silence, and in that silence, respect finally stands at attention.